Hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar on recipes in InduSoft Web Studio. My name is Scott Courtier. I'll be your host today, and we're going to cover, in general, what recipes can be used for, basic recipe configuration, and then we're going to create a simple interface to allow you to interface to that. Again, a simple interface, not meant to be all-inclusive, good-looking, or anything like that. And then we're going to tie recipes together with an external database, and we're going to take a look at how to do that. And once we do that, part of that will be loading recipes, viewing and modifying them before we commit them to the PLC, so to speak. Today's webinar is going to be very fast and fast-paced. I'm going to build an application, do a lot of scripting. The scripting I actually have in a separate page off screen. I'm just going to do a lot of copying and pasting. For your benefit, when we post the recording of this, and yes, we do record these, this will get posted within a few days usually. But when we post the recording, I'll also post the project that we create, so you can download that and take a look at the scripting a little bit closer. Also, we'll send out a follow-up survey after this, and let us know how we did today, how we're doing in general, if there's another topic that you'd like us to cover on a webinar. We already have 150 or more webinars recorded up on the website. Take a look at those. If there's a topic we haven't covered, let us know in that survey. Also in that survey, if you send us your shirt size, we're going to send you a free t-shirt just for joining us. And also let us know if you'd ever like to co-host a webinar with us. We're always looking for co-hosts. Show off your application, show other people how you've solved problems with InduSoft Web Studio, and also potentially get your company some free advertising. So it's kind of a win-win-win for everybody here. Before I continue any further, if I could get a sound check with our rest of our marketing team, that would be awesome. Just make sure everybody can hear me here. And I don't see anything coming in. Can somebody? There we go. Just making sure that everybody can hear. That's another point, is that on this type of webinar, I can't hear you. So if you've got any questions or comments, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel on the WebEx interface. Awesome. Thank you for those of you who have let me know that you can hear me. Appreciate that. All right, so let's get started here. What are recipes used for? What can they be used for? Well, they're not only for food, although since the name kind of implies they often come from the idea of food recipes, but you can use them for things like part parameters, initializations, setting up machines, rather than trying to do that all kind of in an off script or a startup script or something like that. If you want some configurability to that, that might be the best way to do that. Give you an example. One of the things that I did a long time ago with InduSoft. Actually, for those of you who don't know anything about me, I was actually a customer before I was an InduSoft employee, and I worked on a plastic injection molding machine. And one of the things we used recipes for is we set up the parameters for the mold. There were about 200 parameters settings for a particular die in the mold, or a die in the machine, a mold, another name for that. And they could move that mold from one machine to another machine. And they used recipes. They saved those either onto a USB stick or onto a network drive. And then when they moved the mold to another machine, they would load in that recipe, and most of the 200 parameters that were stored there were all set up and ready to go when they moved that mold to the new machine. So it saved them a lot of time for setup. Another thing, as I've mentioned here, is initializations. I've got a project that I've loaded here that I've occasionally will do demos with. I'm going to try to bring this here on screen. And this is, not to confuse you, because this is actually a report. And sometimes I personally get confused between reports and recipes. I'll start down a path of doing one versus the other. We are truly in a recipe webinar here, but this is a report where I actually create an HTML report, but it's an invoice. And in order to do that invoice, what I've done is I've created some recipes that allow me to bring in the bill to and the ship to addresses for these different companies. And I've done that once, and I don't have to then type that all in every time I'm doing a test with this. Also notice here this file name is basically it's the invoice name or the bill name inside of curly brackets. That's going to be used to save that to a file on the hard drive. So if I run this project real quick, you'll be able to see that how I've used recipes. So I don't have to type in the bill to and ship to address. And also on this report, just to give you an idea, I'm going to take this trend and I'm going to take a snapshot of that. So first we're going to select the customer. Now this is going to let me choose my recipes that are out there. And now these recipes are actually customer names. So let's go with, here's Big Cow. We can load that in. You can see how it brought in all that information. I could go with Hayfields, so on and so forth. So I haven't had to type that in. So I use that sometimes when I'm doing tests or simulations to initialize a whole bunch of tags all at once. Now, just so you can see how this works is I'm going to export this trend that I've made, and that'll create a JPEG, and I'm going to print that report. I'm going to open the report, and let's see, what did I go with? Hayfields, so that's down here with today's date. And there's my invoice, bill to, ship to, all that information got included there. That's just an HTML report. I think I've demonstrated this before on other webinars, but the real main idea here is just showing that I can use recipes to do initializations. With that, oops, I accidentally hit run here. Let's go back here, hit stop. With that, let's see. The idea of a recipe is to be able to load many parameters based on a triggering event. Now, whether that triggering event is a button, it doesn't have to be a button. A lot of people don't realize that it doesn't have to be a button. It can be a script. It can be done in a scheduler. It can be done from a database. It can be done in lots of other places. Anything that can change the value of a tag can trigger an event to happen. It can be done, again, in lots of different areas, either in VB script, the built-in scripting language, etc. So today, what we're going to do is show you the basic configuration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a recipe worksheet with the names of the tags, and that will be my template. And then I'm going to create a very basic interface on a screen. I'm going to make a way to choose the file name or the recipe name. That'll be used as the file name. So you're going to type that in, and then we're going to hit make a button to then save the recipe. And once I do this, and for today's recipes, we're going to create food type recipes just because it's kind of easier to understand. But again, these could be part profiles, part parameters, setups for machines, etc. Today we're going to make sugar cookies, and then I'm going to change the name. I'm going to type in the new name, and I'm going to hit save, and we're going to make chocolate chip cookies, and then I'm going to hit save, and we're going to make oatmeal cookies. Now notice that these all have .xml. The file format that in the current version of InduSoft Web Studio, by default, we save those as XML. In previous versions, it was a file type called .dat, and we've since changed that default. I'll show you where that is. Once we have those saved out on the hard drive, then we'll make an interface that will then allow us to choose the recipe by name. We'll basically type it back in. Again, this isn't going to be the best use of this. This is going to be a real simple interface. But then we'll load that function in. It's going to reference that tag worksheet or that recipe worksheet, and then it will get the value from the file and write it into the tags. So we're going to go ahead and set that up. We're going to create a real simple interface with save and load and allow you to be able to select that. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to create a brand new project here. We're going to call this Recipe Webinar Afternoon. And I'm going to choose a license here that lets me get going. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about what I'm doing to get to this point. Hopefully, you understand that. If you don't, we've got our training videos online that'll get you started definitely. Again, just as we get going, I've seen a lot of people sign in since I've started. I can't hear you on this type of webinar, so if you have questions, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel, and I'll try to get to those either during or at the end of the presentation. So what we're going to do here to get started is grab this list out of here, and I'm going to go ahead and create, first I'm going to create my, what I want to show first. Let's go ahead and create, let's see, we'll do my database. We'll start with the database. No, we're not going to do the database. Sorry, we're going to do, sorry, I'm reading some notes off screen. We're going to create our recipe worksheet, which is here in this part of the presentation. It's essentially this thing here on the left. I'm going to create my recipe worksheet that has my tags. So let's go ahead and do that. Now that's found here under the Tasks tab, Recipes, Insert. And I'm going to go ahead and put my tags in here in a second. But before I do that, I'm going to give it a file name. Now I could hard code the file name in here. Let's say we're making cookies. I could make cookies.xml. And that would save that always in that same file. But then I wouldn't have any flexibility to create different recipe names. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a string tag, and I'm going to put that tag inside of curly brackets. These are not parentheses, these are the curly brackets, meaning that there's going to be a tag name in here or a built-in function. In this case, it's going to be recipe name. And when I close that in curly brackets, it's going to prompt me, hey, do you want to create that? I'm going to do this as a string. And then I'm going to create my tags that are going to tell me the amounts of ingredients that I'm going to have. Now, for this recipe, we're going to make some different types of cookies. We're going to make sugar cookies, oatmeal cookies, and chocolate chip cookies. So we need some ingredients. We're going to do, oops, make sure I'm in the right field here. We're going to do flour. And I'm going to make all of these integers just to make this easy. And we're going to make sugar as a tag. Again, that's going to be an integer. We'll then have water. And I realize that there's going to be much more ingredients that you'd have in cookies, but this is just to develop the concept for you. Water. And then as we make our different types of cookies, we'll have oats. And then we'll also have chocolate chips. And notice that this has Save as XML checked. In previous versions, earlier versions of InduSoft Web Studio, that was not checked, and the default file type was, file extension was .dat. Now it's XML. It makes it a little bit more humanly readable. I'll show you what happens when we create that. So I'm going to close this, and notice that, again, I've made my project Recipe Webinar Afternoon. I'm going to save, oh, I forgot to create that tag. I'm going to save my recipe worksheet as recipe 1, and you could name this however you wanted to based on the different products. In fact, you could put in a description in here, and again, you could save that as different ways, but I like to use this way. It helps me kind of understand what that is. Now, for those of you who have never seen this before, let me show you. So I've made this Recipe Webinar Afternoon project, and in here is my folder structure with all of my different stuff in here. And what we've just done here in the config folder is it's created that recipe1.rcp, that template, if you will. So it's essentially here. And now I got to go create this little user interface to be able to save and load and change my name so we can save those recipes. So let's go back out here to Screens, Inserts. We'll make a screen. This will be my main screen. And we need some ways to enter those various things. So we'll make a way to enter recipe name. That's just static text. And until I put some hash marks in there, I can't turn this into a text data link. So now that I have those hash marks in here, I can apply the text data link animation to that. And I'll make the first tag in here, recipe name, and we'll make that input enabled. And for a string, I don't have any minimum maximum values. We're just going to, I'll put some, sugar cookies in there, oatmeal and chocolate chip. The next thing that I'm going to do is created a way to edit the amount of the ingredients in here. And let me off screen, let me move some stuff around here so I can see everything. Okay, so what I'm going to do is a way to edit my ingredients. And the first one was, oops, sorry, let's do this again. And we'll do flour. And I'm just going to give 3 hash marks for that. Again, apply the text data link. And we'll do that tag. We've already created that tag. I don't want to do any more typing than I have to, so I'm going to be a little bit efficient here and use that object finder. And then I'm going to even be more efficient or cheating. I'm going to copy this tag, just the text of this. I'm going to hit Control C. I'm going to want input enabled in here. But since I've copied that that label, I can then change this. I'll show you this idea here in a second. Now that I've done that, before I do that, let's make sure I have that input enabled. I'm going to hold down my Control key and drag a copy of this down. And now I'm going to select a new tag for this. So the second tag was sugar. And here's the part that I wanted to show you. So I'm going to copy this tag, go back to the caption here, and just paste the text name in there because I want to reuse that label. So I'm going to do that down here a few different times. I'm going to go back to the text data link. I'm going to grab the next tag, which is water, and again, copy that. I'm not really copying the tag. I'm just copying the text so I can put it in this caption here. And then copy this down, go back to here. The next one was oats. And I broke kind of my own rule here. Let's copy that. Go back here, paste, and copy that down. And the last one will be chocolate chips. And again, go back here and choose chocolate chips. And then put that in the caption. All right, so this is about as basic of an interface as you can get. It's not going to prompt us for the recipe name. It's not going to tell us when we have to enter that. It's just going to be the most basic thing it can be. So what we're going to do is we're going to enter that recipe name, type in ingredient amounts here, whether it's pounds or kilograms or whatever the case may be, and you can set up units on those. Now we need a way to save that recipe. So what I'm going to do is put a button down here, and many of you might have seen this idea in the training videos or the training class, but it's a good refresher. Save, and now I need to use the built-in function to do recipes here. So I'm going to go into the help system here. I'm going to type in recipe and go to the built-in function called recipe. And the idea here is it's just the function is called recipe, and then inside of parentheses is a string that represents the operation and the file. And the format of that is like so. It's the operation, colon, and then the file. And the file is that recipe 1 template that we have out there. And then the operations are these 4 different options. Save, load, and delete, or initialize. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and use this example for save. And this is one of the reasons why I used my recipe 1 as the name, because I can just literally copy this text here, go back to my button, and apply a command animation. Now I could do this, since this is a built-in script, I could put this in the expression field here. I think it's just on a webinar, it's a little bit more readable if I do this in a VB script interface. If I do this in VB script interface, I have to precede that with a $, and I'm just going to paste that in there. So that's going to save against my recipe template 1, that file name that I've created here with this recipe name. So let's go ahead and save this screen and do that. And now I know I haven't created the load piece of this yet. Now I do this for a reason, and the reason is I have a lot of people sometimes when I teach classes that they don't know what to do step by step. Do I hit load first? Do I hit save first? So I'm going to do this in the order of operations to explain it to you, and you get to create the interface that you want for your customers. So I'm going to go ahead and make that main screen the startup screen, and when I run this, we're going to create, the first thing we're going to create is sugar cookies. And because this is kind of my first recipe, we'll make this a little bit easier to understand what's changing here. We'll do 11 flours, we'll do 200 sugars, we'll do 11 waters, and there's no oats in sugar cookies and no chocolate chips. I realize, again, there's probably eggs and you know, some baking soda and some other things in there. But what I want to show here is when I hit save, what's going to happen is out on my recipe webinar here, it's created that file, sugar.xml. And if I open this up with a text editor, here I'm using Notepad, here you can see that it's made that file that's humanly readable. In fact, you could edit this if you wanted to. Here you can see flour with 11, sugar with 200, etc. So again, that is humanly readable. And then what I'm going to do is create then my oatmeal cookies. We'll just call this oats. And then we'll have 22 flour, 22 sugar, 22 water. We'll do 300 oats and no chocolate chips in this batch of oatmeal cookies. We'll save that and just show what happened here is it created oats.xml. And then I'm going to make chocolate chip cookies. And we'll do 33, 33, 33, no oats. Whoever wants oats in a chocolate chip cookie, I never will understand that. And we're going to make some really awesome chocolate chip cookies. We'll put 400 chocolate chips in each cookie, and we'll save that. And then you can see here that's choc chip out there. Notice that this XML is lowercase. That's going to come into play in a little while. So at this point, now I'm going to flip back to the PowerPoint. I've created this interface and done this step. I've used the save button, typed in a name, and saved all three of those different files. Now we're going to go to the other end of this. We're going to be able to choose a recipe by name. We're going to type that in that recipe field. And then we're going to use the load function. And I'll show you how to use that next. And what that's going to do is that's going to reference that template that we created, and then it's going to load the value from those files, whether it's sugar cookies, chocolate chip cookies, or oatmeal cookies, and then write those values to tags. So let's go ahead and do that now. And on that screen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the save button here. I'm going to change the label on this button from save to load. And part of the reason why I'm doing this is I want to keep the buttons the same size, the same look and feel, but the difference between the save and the load function is really just changing the word save to the word load, and it'll again reference that same template, and at that point I'm pretty much done. So let's go ahead and give this a try, and I'll run this. And since I've already got those files out there, and again, this probably is not the best interface, but you'll get the point. If I want to go back to sugar cookies, I can type in sugar, and I can hit load, and watch the parameters here. When I hit load, it reads that file off of that XML file off of the hard drive and puts those values back in. Let's go to oats, and this is not going to check me for spelling or anything. There's oats, and now let's go back to choc chips. And did I do chip or chips? It must have been chip. And there is a better way to do this. There we go, choc chip. Now, we have done some scripting that gives you a much better way to do this rather than trying to type it in, especially if you don't know the name. It might be real neat if you have parts that you could provide a drop-down list, a combo box there. Well, one of the things that we've come up with a really neat script here, and I'll explain it as I do it. I'm going to do select and load. Hopefully that all fits on one button. And I have some script off screen, and what I'm going to do is copy that and paste this in here. Now what this is going to do is this read file N is going to open up a little browser window, and the 0 here means that that is not something that you can change the path. The user can't change the path. It's going to open it up, in this case, in the path of my where my project lives. and it's going to filter all the XML files and just present me with those. Whenever the user clicks on one, it returns the entire path, the file name, and the extension into a new tag that I'm going to create here in a minute called temp. Then on this next line, it basically takes that temp tag and replaces the path with a blank, and then the next step is it replaces the file extension with a blank, and then writes the whole thing into that recipe name, which is just the same thing as I'm doing typing in here, but in this case I'm choosing it from the list, and then the last thing that I'm doing is that recipe load. Really kind of slick interface when you look at it. So temp doesn't exist. That's going to contain the entire path, the file name, and the extension. So that's going to have to be a string type tag. And when we go ahead and run this, you'll see just how much nicer this makes this. So here I can hit select and load recipe. I'm going to choose oats, click on OK. I should see oats, and it's already loaded that in there. I'll go back to sugar, and you can see just how much cleaner that is. And of course, we could get all kinds of checks and balances in it to make sure things were working right and efficiently, so on and so forth. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of tuck this stuff up in the corner here a little bit, so I don't have to create a new screen. And let's just get this over here in a little bit more efficient manner. All right, so because I'm going to save some room over here so I don't have to create a second screen. What I'm going to do now is an alternative to using the recipe worksheet. Instead of saving those files up to the hard drive, I'm going to use a database. And what I'm going to do now is go ahead and create that database. So I'm using Microsoft SQL Server Express 2014. And so that's opening up here. And when that opens up, I'm going to create, first I'm going to connect to my database engine. And for those of you who haven't seen this before, this is going to use my PC name when I connect to this, because my database lives on my laptop here. But to point it to this database, it's SQL Express. When I configure this in InduSoft Web Studio, I'm not going to use my PC name, because if I deploy this on another computer, I don't want it to look at the database on my computer. I want it to look at the database on the computer that it's running on. Also notice that I'm using Windows Security. So here I'm going to connect to my database engine, and then I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new database for today's webinar. So I'm going to do recipe, webinar, afternoon. And when I hit OK, it's going to create that database. That usually happens all the way down here at the end. And recipe, webinar, afternoon. And I'm going to expand this so you can see that the tables are really just the system and file tables. So I've not created any tables. This is basically an empty database at this point. We're going to go ahead and create two tables in here. Let me go back to my PowerPoint, make sure I'm doing the right things here. We're going to create a database with two tables. I'm going to make a recipe list. This will allow you to create a list of the recipes that you have, and then a separate table that keeps track of the recipe values for each of the recipes in that first list. Now, to display this, we're going to put two grid objects on the screen, the first one pointing to recipe list, and then the next one keeping track of the values. And then we're going to add buttons over the recipe list to add, edit, and delete the recipes, and then buttons to load and save, very much how we did back on those basic recipes a few minutes ago. And then a concept of loading the values in, and then before we send them to the PLC, we have the option to view or modify them before we commit them to the PLC. So I'll add all of these buttons up there. And let's see if I have any other screens. So after I get done with this, we'll go to some Q&A. Again, if you have questions, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel. I'm going to go back here into the database, and now we're going to create two new tables. The first table that we're going to create is called recipe list. And that will be the list, I'm sorry, this eventually will be recipe list, but the columns that we're going to put in here, the first is going to be recipe ID, and that will be like a number of the recipe. and that's going to be an integer data type. So let's go ahead and choose integer in here. And then the next will be the recipe name, and that will be a string. In this case, we'll do maybe a 20-character string, and then when I save that, then I'm going to save that as recipe list. Okay, so there's that table. I can go ahead and close that. You should be able to see when I refresh this that it has that recipe list in there. I'll go ahead and create the next table, and this is going to be for my values. So in this case, I'm going to need 3 columns. I'm going to need the recipe ID again. And you know what? Since I used, I might have to change something there. This recipe ID will be an integer, and you know what? Let's see if I can change this here. I don't remember if I did uppercase or lowercase over there, or if it matters. It might matter. The column, then parameter ID. We'll just do param ID, and that will be also an integer. And then the last will be the param value, and that'll also be an integer. And let's see. Whoops, what did I do here? I meant to close this. Save changes, what am I doing here? I meant to do this. Save table as recipe. What is this one? Recipe values. And, oh, no, wait a minute. Do I want to do this? Recipe ID, param ID, param value. Yep. Okay. And so when we refresh this table here, we have the recipe list. Let me open that up again. Let's see if I can go into the design mode of that. And okay, I did use it uppercase there. Good. All right. And now we can minimize this for the time being. And we're going to go create our 2 grid objects here. So in here, we're going to add 2 grid objects. You know what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a nice little separator line here to just kind of show you that there's 2 different techniques here. And then over here on this side, I'm going to add a grid. And on this grid, this will be the recipe list. So let's go ahead and label that. I'll put a rectangle up here above this, and I'll just double click on this, get rid of the border, get rid of the fill, and in the caption field, I will call this recipe list, and we'll change the alignment of this and get this left along the left-hand side there, and just put it up there just so we know what's going on. And then in the configuration of this, I'm going to need to go to a database here, to the database that I set up, but I don't have that connection yet. So let's save this screen. We'll make sure we're not running, and I want to set up a connection to that database. There's several different ways to do this. For the grid object, I'm going to set this up and use this as the default database. If I knew this connection string, I could just type this out if I knew how to do that. I don't know how to do that, so we have this really nice little wizard here. I'm going to choose the SQL connection. I'm going to go next, and then here's where I said I'm not going to use my PC name. I'm going to use local, and I could use an IP address in there. And then I'm going to do \SQL Express, and I'm going to use built-in Windows security. And now I need to go to that database and find that database. So the one that we created was recipe webinar afternoon. And so there's that database. I can test my connection. We're good to go there. Say OK. And here's my connection string that it built for me. I'm going to actually cut that. I'm going to do a Control X. I'm going to cut that, And here I'm going to create a connection string tag. Inside of curly brackets, I'll type out connection string. And again, in curly brackets. When I hit OK, it's going to prompt me, hey, that doesn't exist. Do you want to create it? I'm going to make that a string type tag. And here's why. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make this flexible. If I ever need to change that to go to a different database, I'm going to initialize that in my startup script. So right here, I'm going to say $ connection string, and look at the type ahead. The IntelliSense has already got that found for me. And I'm going to say equals, quote. I'm going to paste that string, end my quote. And now it's going to set that up for me. And if I ever need to change it, and if I've created these several places in my project, then I can just change it in the one place. I'm going to go ahead and save that startup script. And where we're going to use this in creating buttons to load and save these recipes is I'm not going to use that default script. I'm going to use this database ERP connection. And I'm going to create this connection here. And the reason I'm doing this is then I can call this up by a name and use the built-in scripting function to tie it connections to that name. But I am going to use that exact same database and that exact same connection, so I can do connection string inside of curly brackets, and then I don't have to do anything else. That's pretty much already done for me. So now I can use that connection name, that DB, that name, when I use my built-in scripting functions to go to that database. Now, back on the grid object that we had started to work on, instead of going to a text file, I'm going to go to a database. I need to go to my data source settings, and it's going to use my project default. Here's where I put in that connection string, and it's going to try to use the name of that database as the table. Well, that's not what we use here. What we want to use, and because I've got this connection string and it's not evaluating that during runtime, it's not going to give me that. So I'm going to type in recipe list, because that was the first table that we want that to go to, that recipe list. And then I need to set up the columns. And the columns for this recipe list, the first column is going to be, let's see, I've got this off screen here. I just want to make sure I'm doing this right. I know why this is, I'm kind of doing this a little bit out of order. I want to make sure I do this right. This first is going to be the ID, and the field name is going to be recipe ID, and that's going to be a number, so that was an integer type. And then the next one is going to be the name of the recipe. That's going to be recipe name, and that's going to be text. And we're going to make this smaller than this. We'll do 100 pixels wide for the ID, and we'll do 400 pixels for the name. And we'll say OK there. And so that gives us our recipe ID and our name. And one of the things that I skipped over in my notes is I want to go create the tags for this before I finish this. So let's make sure we save this, and we'll go into classes. The first thing we're going to do is create a class that's going to hold our recipe parameters. So, for example, my sugar cookies had 11, 200, etc. It's going to store all that. So I'm going to create a class, and we're going to, instead of the 5 different ingredients, I'm going to make 3 for this one. But I need to give that a name, and I'm going to create this recipe class. It's going to be called C recipe, and in here are going to be my 3 different members. One called edit. Now that is as I load my values in, they're going to go into the edit field. So that's going to allow me to view / edit those before I actually commit those to the PLC. And then what shows up in the PLC will be the actual. And then I'm going to also have a name, and that'll be of string type. So each of the those 3 fields will have that in there. And you know what? I think I might want to change something here. I need to, ID, I think that's good so far. I might have something show up as a number that needs to be a string. I'll double check that as we get going here. So let's create some tags. So we've already made the connection string. We've already made the rest for our basic recipe. Let's now, when we add recipes to our first grid object, we're going to need to tell that to reload. So I'm going to make a tag here that's an integer type tag, and we're just going to increment the reload tag, and that'll cause it to trigger and refresh that. We need a selected value. So I'm going to call this select SELVAL, and this will be an array of 2, which is actually 3. It's 0, 1, and 2, and that will be, make sure I have this right, string. And that's what's going to receive our values when we move up and down the rows in the grid object. And I'll show you where that comes in here in just a minute. And we've just got a couple more to do here. The RCP, this is going to be the actual values of our recipe. And this is going to be 3, because we're going to have 3 parameters in our recipe, much similar to how we did flour, sugar, water, chocolate chips, and oatmeal. Well, we're only going to have 3 parameters in this one just to keep it simple. And instead of being one of the data types that we have here, we're going to use this as the C recipe class that we created a few minutes ago. And notice that icon changes up there. And then we're going to have a place to store the recipe number, and that will be an integer, and then the recipe name, and that will be a string. And we've already got the connection string in the startup script, and so I've created that first grid. Let's go ahead and go back to that first grid, and in here I've pointed it to the recipe list, and I've got the columns in here as recipe ID and recipe name. I've got that 100 and 400, and then I need to go configure the reload, which I need this to refresh when I add new ones in here, so we'll put the reload tag in here. And every time I do one of these scripts, you'll see that I increment the reload tag, and that automatically causes us to refresh. And then I need that selected value. Oops, if I could type here. And in this case, it's going to reference index number 1. Now, when we click on one of these rows, this entire row is essentially going to go into this array tag, and then I can be able to look at elements of that array tag. So that's why we're doing that. So I think that is everything that I need there. And now we're going to create a way to add recipes in this list. So I'm going to put a button up here on the top of the screen, and we'll just call this add. Again, this is just the label for this. And the command animation for this will be a script that I have off screen. And I'm going to copy this and paste it in here. And again, you don't have to try to write this all down, because I'm going to include this project on the recording on the website, so you can download that later. But basically, this is going to, when we click on this, it's going to prompt us, going to put up an input box and ask you to enter the recipe number, and then another one to answer the recipe name, and then it's going to create this SQL statement here in this variable called SQL. And then it's going to use that SQL in this DB execute command against that DB connection that I have, named connection. It's going to insert the recipe ID and the recipe name into those fields. And I see here recipe ID. Okay, I just want to make sure that matches, because I set up that table with an uppercase I and an uppercase D. And here's where we increment the reload, so it automatically refreshes that. So that will allow us to add a new recipe in that list. So now let's add another button, and this one will be to edit. So we'll do edit on here. I'll go into the command animation, And again, I'm going to be off screen here grabbing this script so I don't have to type this in front of you. And then that way I know it's correct as well. I'll paste this in here. I think there was an extra space in front of that. And this will actually allow us to update the record. So very similar, we're going to select from the list. That'll get our name, our ID, and that select val tag. We're going to allow you to enter the name or edit that name, and then update the record, do a DB execute on the database, and then refresh that. Now, if we don't have a selected recipe, because this requires that you actually have one selected, if we don't have a recipe line selected, if you haven't clicked on that grid, we want to disable this button. So here we're going to disable that with if selected value basically is 0 or less than 0, then we want to disable that. So that allows us to add or edit recipes. And the next thing that we're going to do is create a delete button so that we can delete recipes out of the database. And again, the command animation, and here's the script for that. Let me grab this off screen, I should say, and we'll expand that. So what this one's going to do is allow you to choose a recipe line. When you say you want to delete, it's going to prompt you, are you sure you want to delete that? If your answer is no, kind of skips over this, but if your answer is yes, then it deletes where it matches the ID and recipe where the recipe ID, so it deletes the values and the list in there. So, and then it refreshes it. So that's what's going on with that one. All right, that should be the basics for that. And now, in order to, this is just going to create our names for our recipe. Very similar to how we did sugar, oats, and chocolate chip when we saved those XML files in the previous recipe. Now we're going to go create a second grid object and set that up a little similar. So let's come over here. And this one is not going to be the list of recipes. This one's going to actually be the current recipe. So what I have done off screen is I actually have some text in here. This is going to show the text current recipe, and then in curly brackets it's got recipe number, a hyphen, and then recipe name. So it's going to show us the recipe number, a hyphen, and the recipe name up there on the top of that. I might make this just a little bit longer here. There we go. And this grid, instead of going to the database, it's actually going to go look at the class tag that we've created back in the database here. So let's go in here. It's actually going to look at this tag here. So let's go close that, go back in here. And so instead of going to a database, we're going to go for the class tag. And this class tag, it's going to be RCP, and it's going to look at index 1 for that. It's going to start at index 1 just to make that a little bit more humanly readable. And then we're going to have 3 items in there. Say OK. And then now we have to go configure the columns. Now the first column is going to be the name of the recipe, and that will be, let's see, what do we make that? I think we actually made that name. Let me go back and double check that. Say OK here. Yep, we did name, edit, and actual. So we're going to make those columns. We'll do name and edit and then actual. And these are not going to be text. These are going to be numeric. And we'll make this name. We'll do this 400 pixels. And I guess 100 and 100, and we don't want them to be able to change the name on this side, but they can change those values. So we'll uncheck that input, and that should be all that we need to do there. And maybe make this just a touch wider so that it doesn't have the scroll bar on there. Okay. And all right, so on this side, we're going to have a way to save and load the recipe, much like we did way over here for this recipe. Whoops, my mouse is a little jumpy here. This save and load, we're going to have a similar concept over here. So we're going to make a button over here. And first thing we're going to want to do is save. And the command animation for that will be a wild script here that I'm going to grab off screen. And again, if you've got questions, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel. I'll try to get to those. If not, there's a Q&A section at the end. So here's the script for that. Basically, we're going to take the recipe ID and the recipe name and save that. Let's see, if you edit this, you have the choice of deleting that or inserting this into the database. And again, I didn't write this script. Mostly I understand this, but if you've got very specific questions about this, I might not be able to answer this. But again, when we're writing this into the database, essentially we're taking this SQL command and we're inserting into the recipe values table those three parameters, the recipe ID, the parameter ID, and the parameter value, and we're writing those into that, executing this against that database connection, and then refreshing the other table. Also on this one, much like on the other ones, if I don't have a recipe selected on the other side, I really don't want people using this, so we'll disable that if there's no recipe selected. Then the next button that we have to do is a load button over here. And we'll make that label load. And in the command animation, we will do some more script here. And we will also make this disabled if there's no recipe selected over on the left-hand grid. So what this will do is allow you to load this in from the database. So this does a select statement. And this builds this up into the SQL command. And this does a little bit different because this is got to do a little bit different things here. So basically it loads in the data set, pulls in the entire data set into this numcur VB script variable. Then we look to see how many rows are in here and then see where things match, the ID and the recipe, and then we load that in. We have to make sure we close that connection. If we don't, it's going to leave a lot of memory. You're going to have a memory leak, and you'll have memory problems later. So we need to make sure we close that, and then we'll do a refresh of that left-hand grid there. Say OK. And then the last thing that we need is once we've edited those values, we need a way to commit those to the actual values in the PLC. So what I'm going to do is one more button, and then we can go ahead and test this and get this to work. We'll say commit to PLC. And for that, we're going to basically download this to the PLC. And what we're going to do is I'm going to take from this column however many we have and just write those over to the actual. So here I'm going to take the edit values and write them to the actual. If you have a PLC connected, what you would do would be to set up this tag here, this recipe and then ID actual for each of those recipes in a driver sheet, let's say, and then have that go to your PLC addresses. So for however many of those you have, go to your PLC, and let's say we've got ID 1, 2, and 3 here. So we'd have those three addresses tied to three separate addresses in the PLC, and that's how you would get those to move over into the PLC. You have to set up a driver worksheet for that. So I think I have everything here. Oh, one thing that I forgot to do is in the startup script to be able to initialize this, I need one little piece of script here. So also in the startup script, what I'm going to do is drop down a line here, and I'm going to initialize this so that when I put the parameter in there, the name of the recipe will have parameter, a space, and then the ID number kind of tacked on the end of that. and you'll see that here in a minute. So I'll save that, close this, save this, run my whole project, and then hopefully we'll get this thing to work here in the next couple of minutes. All right, so there's my parameter list. It's reading that out of that tag, that class tag or array. Is it class tag? I think it's a class tag at that point. And I need to, you know what, let me move this down because that's just a little bit high off the top of the screen. Make sure everybody can see that. Let me grab all of this stuff here. Just move it down a bit. Okay, save that and run this again. And so now I want to add a new recipe here. So we're going to add, notice that my buttons, and I probably just skipped this part, are grayed out that I can't do because I don't have a selected recipe yet. So let's add a recipe. We'll call this recipe number 1, and we'll type in, let's call this ONE for 1, and say OK. And so there's my recipe. And now I've selected it. Hopefully you saw when I selected that, these buttons came to life. I can load that recipe in. Before I do that, let me go out to my database, and I will go into my recipe list, and I'll edit top 200 rows. You can see it's created my recipe ID 1 and the recipe name 1 there. And at this point, if I go into my recipe values here, that's still empty. But if I go back into my runtime here and I say, okay, I've got in parameter 1, I've got values of 11, 11, and 11, and I save this. Are you sure you want to do that? I think this will go into the right one here. Let's go back now into my recipe. Where's my database here? Recipe webinar, recipe values, edit top 200, and you know what? This morning. So if something I got going on in the code is not checking me exactly right, let's try that again. Let's click on this. Let's load that. There's my recipe 1. Let's save that. Are you sure you want to save to that? And now if I go back into this and refresh this, and again, this isn't meant to be perfect. This is just meant to give you the general concept at a high-end level. So yeah, so for whatever reason, I started with a 0 there, but now you can see I have recipe ID 1, and there's my values in there. I can then go make a recipe 2. So let's type in recipe 2, and this will be TWO, and I could put in any name in there. I just want to make sure this is easy to understand. We'll go down here to 2. I'll load that in, and so now I'm on current recipe 2, and here I'll put in, let's say 200, 200, and 200. And we'll save that. Make sure you want to commit that to the database. We'll go in here, and then we'll look at this again, and we'll edit top 200 rows. So there's my, I don't know why I had that original one in there, but there's my recipe 1 and the values. There's my recipe 2 and its values. And now I can come back here and say, okay, I want to load back in recipe number 1, load that in, and I'll get those values in. If I want to go back to recipe 2, load those values in, and now it's doing that query on that database and pulling those back in. Now, right now, I haven't committed those to the PLC. Here's the PLC values, and again, I haven't configured a driver worksheet, but it'd be very easy to do that. And now, if I wanted to commit those, I could just hit commit, and then those would go into the PLC. I could change. Let's say I wanted to mess with this a little bit and say that's 201. I could commit that to the PLC. What's actually in the PLC now matches here. I could load that recipe back in from the database, and it changes. So here I can see that there's a mismatch. And maybe I want to go back to recipe 1 and delete that. If I hit delete, are you sure you want to do that? Yep. And now if I go back into the database, and now it doesn't automatically refresh. If I go in here, my recipe 1 has been deleted. So it is exactly 1 hour after we've started. That's pretty much all that I wanted to show you today. Hopefully you understand what I did and was able to add, edit, delete, load, save, and send to the PLC, kind of in this idea of load, view, modify, and then commit. Same thing, not only in a database, but in back in the other way that I created the recipes with the recipe worksheet. I could load those into tags before I committed those to the PLC, much in a similar way. Let's see, questions. There's a question come in, but I can't quite read it. Came in a little late. I assume if my PLC is talking to a scale, I could use a real number or float. Yeah, I just I did an integer just to keep it simple. So yeah, you could do pound and a half of sugar, so you could do 1.5. You could do a float. Yeah, so whatever the database supports. I just did it to keep it real simple. So yeah, you could use floating points. And a question that came in during the registration was, can I just use recipe numbers? Yeah, you don't have to use recipe names. You could use, in this example here, instead of a string tag for the recipe name, this is whatever a file name can be. So it could be a number. So you could use a number there. And instead of using a name for my recipe, like sugar or water, sugar cookies or chocolate chip cookies, you could just use a number there if you wanted to. So again, it's I've got this open up for questions. If you have any questions, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel. Hopefully you got some good information out of this. I learned a lot in setting this up and trying to do this. I think this is a great application. Shows you how to work with a database to do recipe management. And that way you don't have to rely on files on the hard drive. And if you've got a problem, it's typically the database will be backed up, things of that nature. So I don't see any other questions coming in. Just a reminder, I will be posting this, either this project or the one that I did this morning. They're very similar, the exact same scripting, up when we post the video. The video will be up in a couple of days. Doesn't happen immediately. It usually takes a couple of days. And so then you can download the video, download the project, and take a look at this. Good compliments coming in. Really appreciate that. Thank you. And with that, if you need to get a hold of us, you can always send an email to info@InduSoft. If you need support at InduSoft, you can call us. You can chat on our website. And other than that, oh, you know what? I accidentally clicked on the German version of the website here. My fault. I meant to click on the slide so it would advance. So then, thank you. Really appreciate everybody's time and your interest in InduSoft Web Studio. Lots of people logged in here. Really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Everybody have a great day. Join us again for another webinar, and let us know if you're interested in co-hosting a webinar with us. Fill out that survey. Thanks, and have a great day.